Hey everybody, Mr. Taylor here to teach you guys a little bit more about the nervous system. And today we're going to be looking at part two of our nervous system and nervous tissue notes. So before we begin, I have a warm-up question for you to do. So take a look at these four questions. Go ahead and pause your video and answer them. And when you unpause it, I'll give you the answers. All right. So the first question asks us which two organs make up the CNS. So if you remember from our first lecture, CNS stood for Central Nervous System. And so this is like your processing center. So there are two organs here, the brain and the spinal cord. And of course, these are responsible for processing information. The next one we have four structures that make up the PNS or peripheral nervous system. And we're actually going to be talking about the PNS a good bit today. Okay, and this is where we have nerves, we have ganglia. This is known in no particular order. We have sensory receptors, oops, and we have, last but not least, enteric plexuses. And if you want to know more about what these things do, I'll just tell you. Nerves are involved in transmitting information like wires. Ganglia are like little masses that are kind of like relay stations in those wires. Sensory receptors are all over your body and they're used to receive sensory signals. And enteric plexuses regulate your digestion. And we're going to talk about these a lot more today too. The function of ganglia, as mentioned, ganglia are like relay stations in the nervous system. Great. And finally, differentiate between afferent, efferent, and interneurons. Okay, so when we look at these, some of these give us some clues. So efferent, EFF, these are neurons that go to effectors. Okay, so they send signals to effectors. We often call these motor neurons because they're in charge of turning on like the muscles. So it's kind of like your motor, it makes you move. But they also turn on glands too. So effectors would be like muscles and glands. Interneurons, their job is to integrate. And these things are used basically for processing. And where do we find these? Mostly these are in our CNS. And the last one, afferent, these are the guys that send signals from the sensory receptors. Okay, so if we were drawing this in a map, whoops, we would have our sensory receptors that would send signals through the afferent neurons. And we often call these sensory neurons as well. So you can call it one or the other, but afferent's the better term here. Then we have our interneurons, and they're usually a lot shorter, and their job is to integrate. And so what that means is that we could have like signals coming from like several different sensory neurons. We could have several different inputs, and these guys have to integrate them. And you can even have multiple interneurons, but we're just going to keep this simple. And then once the interneurons integrate, they are going to send the signal back through the efferent neuron into the body, also known as a motor neuron. And this is going to connect to our effector, which could be a muscle or a gland. And it's going to produce our response. Now, when we talk about muscle, it could be any type of muscle. So it could be like the heart with the cardiac muscle. It could be a skeletal muscle. It could be a visceral muscle inside of an organ, or it could be an endocrine or an exocrine gland. So some sort of muscle or gland is going to be our effector. And so that's how this works. And so this always goes from sensory receptors towards the effectors. Great. All right, so today, to start some new information, we're going to start learning about the organization of the peripheral nervous system and see what all the different parts of the PNS are. So there are three main parts that make up the peripheral nervous system. There's three divisions, you could say, and they're called the somatic division, the autonomic division, and the enteric division. The somatic nervous system, or SNS, is involved in voluntary movements, voluntary processes. And this is what stimulates skeletal muscle, because if you remember from our tissues chapter, skeletal muscle is the only voluntary tissue. So I always think Somatic starts with S, and I always think this reminds me of skeletal. Okay, so that's how I remember those two go together. Anyway, the somatic nervous system is everything that's like voluntary, and you could also say it's like conscious. So a lot of times when we talk about like somatic senses are things that you're consciously aware of, like vision, hearing, stuff like that are considered to be somatic senses. We have other senses that are not somatic. For example, you have blood pressure or oxygen saturation that you are not consciously aware of. So those are not somatic senses. But basically, anything you can voluntarily control or you're like aware of consciously are somatic senses. Autonomic nervous system, the ANS. I always think this autonomic means automatic. Now, if you look up the word autonomic, it literally means self regulating or self managing. And because this system basically runs itself, it's involuntary. It's an automatic system that runs itself. And so this system is not only automatic, it's highly related to my favorite word, homeostasis. This is your homeostasis system. Okay, so it involuntarily, like you cannot control this, goes through your body and controls your smooth and cardiac muscle and your glands. So if you think about it, you can't consciously control whether you sweat or not. You just sweat when you get hot. You sweat when you get nervous. It just happens. You can't control your heart rate. Your heart beats faster or slower depending on what your body needs or how nervous or relaxed you are. And same thing with smooth muscle. You can't control like how fast your stomach digests your food. It doesn't work. So all those things are autonomic functions. They're involuntary. And basically the idea here is that if you were consciously aware of everything going inside your body, you wouldn't be able to concentrate. You'd have too many things going on. So the ANS kind of like takes this off your plate and does this stuff in the background, which is pretty cool. Kind of related to that is this thing called the enteric nervous system, or the ENS. And the enteric nervous system, if you guys remember, we said that the word enteric, anytime we see this, means intestine. This is your intestinal nervous system. And sometimes they call this the brain of the gut. It's like its nickname, or gut brain, I guess you could call it, because it's literally the brains that run your digestive tract. And so this is also involuntary. So once again, you can't directly control it. Um, and basically, this turns on the smooth muscle and glands, particularly in the GI tract. So in other words, like esophagus, stomach, intestines, that sort of thing. And so basically, it turns all of them on and regulates your digestion. And the interesting thing is that this can work without the brain. That's what's interesting about this. So, your autonomic nervous system requires your brain. It has connections to your brain, but the enteric nervous system can actually completely bypass your brain and work without it. That's why it's called the brain of the gut, because it doesn't necessarily even need the CNS. So, let's take a look. So these are just showing you some of the different parts of the nervous system. And of course, we can see the brain and the spinal cord are part of the CNS, and you can see all their different functions. And you can just go ahead and pause the video and read all the different functions if you'd like. It's not a bad idea to familiarize yourself with all of these. But then you can see how connected to those. We have all these nerves that are going to act as like the wires of the body. We have the ganglia, and it tells you how in the ganglia, we have reception of sensory stimuli by dorsal root and cranial ganglia. And we'll talk about what those are later. And then you see how it says relay of visceral motor responses by autonomic ganglia. So visceral, of course, meaning organ. Your ganglia are relaying information to the visceral muscle of your organs through these autonomic ganglia. And then you can see the digestive tract down there in the ENS, right, where it says it's responsible for autonomous functions and can operate independently of the brain and spinal cord, which I think is pretty crazy. Here's another really important, this is a very important diagram, so make sure you take a good look at this. And once again, you can pause it and read it if you'd like. But basically what they're showing you here is they're showing you those three divisions. And it shows how the SNS is going to feed into the CNS. So it's going to feed somatic and special sensory receptors into the CNS. And then the CNS can have outputs that are somatic, sending everything out to your motor neurons, your voluntary motor neurons, like skeletal muscle. So basically, all your conscious stuff that you do is up here in the somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system has these autonomic sensory receptors that basically are monitoring things that we're not even aware of. So, like, how much oxygen you have, your blood glucose, things like that. They're sending this information to your brain. The brain can then go and turn on autonomic motor neurons in the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. So, we're going to talk all about these later. But this is basically your fight or flight and rest and digest. And then this is what it can turn on. It can turn on your smooth muscle, your cardiac muscle, and your glands. Okay, so basically everything that's not skeletal muscle. Now, the ENS is the weird one. Okay, so far this should make sense to you, I hope. So basically, we have like our voluntary conscious somatic system, and we have our automatic unconscious involuntary autonomic system. If you look at the enteric nervous system, it's really interesting because it's looking at your GI tract. It can send this information to the brain, but sometimes it completely bypasses the brain and goes directly to its own motor neurons that go into these enteric plexuses and turn on smooth muscle glands, endocrine cells of the GI tract. The autonomic nervous system can also send signals to the enteric nervous system. So basically, if your brain wants to get involved with digestion, the ENS sends its signals. The brain has to then go through the ANS to send signals to the ENS to make it do things. So it's a little complicated, but just understand that anytime the brain is trying to, or the CNS is trying to control your digestion, it has to use the autonomic system. So that's one of the ways that it works. All right, so that's it for all the different like parts of the nervous system and how they work together. Now we're going to start looking at specific, like very detailed uh, parts of neurons and neuroglia and how they all work together. So the first thing we're going to look at is in the histology of nervous tissue, a little more in depth, and look at neurons. So neurons, of course, are nerve cells, are the ones that communicate, as we all know. But when we look at a nerve cells look very different from most of the cells that we're familiar with. For example, if you look at a neuron, it has this part called the cell body. And you can see that in this diagram down here. The cell body is also called the soma. I don't really use that term personally, but you may see it out there some places in textbooks and whatnot. But the cell body is basically just like the normal part of the cell that has all the organelles. So it's got like the nucleus and the endoplasmic reticulum, ribosomes, all those things that we're never going to talk about. But it does have all those cell parts. And then connected on to the cell body, we have these little things that stick out called dendrites. And literally, the prefix dendro means tree. So literally, these are tree-shaped signal receiving processes, or what you can think of them as is like an antenna. So just like your car has an antenna, and your cell phone has an antenna inside of it, it's used to pick up signals. That's what these dendrites do. So these things all stick out. They look kind of like little trees, and they stick out and they receive signals. So signals come in to these dendrites. So literally, like remember we talked about the free nerve endings of the skin. When something hits a nerve, those free nerve endings stick out and pick up these signals using their dendrites. The next part is called the axon. And the axon is this long thing right here that sticks out of the nerve cell. And it says a long, thin projection that sends uh, signal impulses. So this is like the transmitter of the neuron. And the easy way to remember that is axons away, because axons send signals away from the nerve cell. They send it down through this long tube to this ending called a synapse. And so a synapse is where two neurons come together. So you can see right down here, they show here's the synapse, and you can see that the axon of this neuron is connected to the dendrites of another. And if you look back up here at the top, you can see here's another nerve cell with its axon sending a signal down, and this axon is connected at a synapse to the dendrites. And so basically, look, axons away, dendrites bring the signal in, send it down the axon, which goes away, dendrites take the signal in. And so you can see how all these neurons kind of make like a chain where they all connect together and send signals. And so a synapse can be formed where two neurons come together, which is pretty common. Or you can see it where a neuron runs into an effector. You may even see a synapse between a neuron and a sensor receptor too. I didn't mention that, but basically it's where cells communicate. Okay, so the synapse is like the communication site. And these are really important. We'll talk about them a little bit later. This little diagram is just showing you some of the different varieties of neurons that you can have. So for example, you can have what's called a unipolar neuron, where basically the cell body is kind of out of the way, and it just sends signals directly from dendrites to axons. In a bipolar, you have dendrites on one side, axon on the other, And a multipolar, you have a whole bunch of dendrites and they're all feeding into one large axon. So basically, all these different signals can get picked up and sent into one thing. And so you notice there's a pattern here. We always see this flow from dendrite to axon. This is a motor neuron in this picture. And you can see it kind of looks like I don't even know what it looks like, but it looks crazy. And you can see that it's got like a bunch of sausage links on the end. And we'll talk about what those are in a minute. But basically, you can see very long axon, but tons of dendrites. So this is a multipolar motor neuron. A couple other different types of cells that you might see. So you can see there's a wide variety in what neurons actually look like, but generally they all kind of look tree-like. All right, so that's enough about neurons. Now let's look at neuroglia. And so once again, neuroglia quite literally means nerve glue. And sometimes we just call these glia or glial cells for short. These are the support cells. And there's anywhere between 5 to 50 per neuron. It depends on the part of the body. It depends on the organism. But in the human body, it's about that many. And so there are 6 types of neuroglia, but they only have 4 different jobs. So there's a couple of repeats, which makes it really convenient. In the central nervous system, there are 4 different types of neuroglia: astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, microglia, and ependymal cells. And each one has a very specific and important job. Astrocytes, the word astrocyte literally means star cell. It's one of these guys right here. It looks kind of like a star. And what these things do is they actually pick up nutrients from the bloodstream and send it on to the neurons. So these guys are in charge of kind of like feeding, that's an E, feeding and kind of like nursing neurons. So astrocytes, the reason why they have all these little projections is that they literally are taking up like nutrients and like sending it to different parts of the neuron. So they're kind of like supporting it. So you can think of like these guys as being like the support cells of the CNS. And so the job is that they have is just to make sure that your neurons stay nice and healthy and alive. They protect the neurons because they form this thing called a blood-brain barrier. Okay, so there's another thing to know. So there's a blood-brain barrier. Or if we're really lazy, we could call it the triple B. But the blood-brain barrier basically means is that there's blood vessels that go through the nervous tissue, but the blood doesn't directly send nutrients to neurons. It has to go through the astrocytes. So part of that feeding that astrocytes do is that they absorb nutrients out of the blood, make sure everything's good before they send it on to the neurons. So basically, just like a nurse would like check the food and make sure the medicine and everything was good for the patient, that's exactly what astrocytes do. They basically are there to keep your neurons safe because neurons are super valuable. The next thing, oligodendrocytes. The prefix oligo means few, and dendro, just like dendrite, means trees. So literally, these are called like few tree cells. And these guys' job is to wrap neurons in this stuff called myelin. And we'll talk about myelin a little bit later, but basically their job is to insulate your neurons. And I didn't really give myself a lot of room here, so I'm just going to write this over here. Their job is to insulate your neurons. And not insulate like they get cold, but like insulate them electrically. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So it's kind of like the, like the wire, plastic coatings you see on wires inside of like an electronic device. That's what these guys do. So here's the oligodendrocytes. And you can see this is one cell and it reaches out these little appendages and it kind of wraps the neuron. So it wraps the neuron over here and it wraps the neuron over here. And then it reaches out to a different neuron and it's wrapping it up too. So all its little appendages are just like wrapping up these neurons. And so oligodendrocytes, as you can see, they have a few little tree-like projections that stick out. Microglia, that's what this guy is right here. These are kind of like macrophages of the nervous system. So the microglia, I'm just going to put a little arrow down because I didn't give myself enough room. Their job is to kill pathogens. So just like remember how like we had Langerhans cells in the skin, we have microglia in the CNS. So they kill pathogens, so they have like an immune response. And I always remember that microbiology is like the study of like microbes. So you could say that they kill pathogens. You could also say that they kill microbes. And that's a good way to remember microglia because they're killing any sort of like bacteria, viruses that would get in. And then the very last type of cell is called an ependymal cells. And ependymal cells, if you look at them, this is a whole bunch of them right here. They look kind of like epithelial cells. And that's the way I remember that. They look like epithelium, but they're not. Their job is to line the ventricles, um, which are parts of your brain that we'll talk about a little bit later, and they produce this stuff called cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF for short, cerebrospinal fluid. Let me write that down here. Should have given myself more room. So cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, is basically the fluid that keeps your brain afloat. Your brain actually floats inside your skull, and that's why people sometimes get concussions is when their brain crashes into their skull. So the spinal cord also floats inside of your vertebral canal. And so cerebrospinal fluid is the fluid that kind of like surrounds and fills both of those, and it's produced by these ependymal cells. And so here's just like a little chart showing you these functions, and you can go ahead and pause this and read all these if you'd like to, but they're just showing you some more of the functions and structure of those four different types of cells. And you can see, I was not kidding, the ependymal cells really do look very much like epithelial cells, but they're actually not. They're from they're a type of nervous tissue, so they actually do not fit the characteristics of epithelium. All right, so that's four down. The last two are found only in the peripheral nervous system. And these guys, fortunately, have almost the exact same roles as cells we already talked about. So the first one is called a Schwann cell, which I believe is named after the man who discovered it. And a Schwann cell is basically the same thing as an oligodendrocyte. So if you're paying attention, this should be really easy. But basically, these guys form myelin. So that's their job, is to form this myelin sheath. And so you can actually see this. This is a cross section of a Schwann cell. The Schwann cells actually grow around the axon of a neuron, and they do this by expanding. They kind of roll over and make more and more and more layers of themselves. They just kind of wrap it up over and over and over again. And all these layers of cell membrane is myelin. Satellite cells, on the other hand, are basically the same as astrocytes. And their job is basically to support the neurons. They're particularly found in the ganglia, if you want to know. So we can write that on here too. And basically what happens is that the ganglion is where we find the cell bodies. And that's why they get kind of fat. So basically, you remember how we said like you have a nerve and then it gets fat and it keeps going. The reason why it gets fat is in here you find these cell bodies, and then you see like the axons continue out. And then here's another cell body. And then there's the axon heading out. And then basically you have these little satellite cells that kind of float around outside of these cell bodies, and basically are just the nurses that take care of those cells. And that's it. That's all for today. Tomorrow we're going to go ahead and continue on with our study of the nervous system and learn about some more specifics related to this. But hopefully you guys learned some good stuff today. If you have any questions, don't forget to hit me up, and have a great day.